Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor and a pleasure. You are all welcome. The 18th seminar, Phase 4 of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network. So thank you, Nauman. Thank you so much for having me in your position of lecturer in law at Leicester Law School. I'm also founder and chief convener of the Global South Network for running the series and for allowing me to chair this week. For anyone who is interested, for anyone who was not around on the last occasion, when I guess I was a discussant, my name is Sebastian Kevany. I've just very briefly spent plenty of time around the world in developing countries, looking at global health and related issues. I've also I've held various adjunct appointments, and I have most recently been a professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii, and written a few books on related subjects. So that is it in a nutshell, but enough about me. Much more important is to welcome Dr. Joseph Harris, fellow discussant. Thank you, Joseph. He is an associate professor of sociology at Boston University and conducts comparative historical research that lies at the intersection of sociology, political science, and global health. So highly relevant to today's topics. He is also author of a book entitled Achieving Access, Professional Movements and the Politics of Health Universalism. Beyond that, he has recently been elected as Vice Chair of the International Studies Association's Global Health Section and is a member of the editorial collective at Studies in Comparative International Development. Even beyond that, he is co-founder of the American Sociological Association's Global Health and Development Interest Group, a past member of the Governing Council of the ASA section on the Sociology of Development, and past associate editor at Social Science and Medicine, that well-known and highly regarded journal. He has received 2 Fulbright scholarships for his research on the politics of health policy in Thailand. So welcome, Joseph. Wow, what an introduction. I feel truly honored, as I'm sure everyone else does. Aditya, who many of you may remember from last time, will be the peer commentator for today's session. He is a PhD researcher at the School of Politics and International Relations at Leeds. His research is examining the role of global health diplomacy as an instrument for peace building in post-conflict northern Uganda, and he has also conducted multidisciplinary research in Somalia, India, South Africa, Ghana, and Kenya. His educational qualifications include BA in Sociology and Religion from Emory and MSc in Global Health from Duke. So really an incredible group today. And last but certainly not least, our guest speaker for today's session is Yue Yang, if I am pronouncing that correctly. I hope so. Yue, thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for your patience. And he is a PhD researcher in East Asian Studies, School of Literature, Language and Culture, University of Edinburgh, and will be presenting as soon as I finish, I guess, on his ongoing PhD research entitled "The Shadow of the Past: How Pre-Existing Preconceptions Hindered China's Health Diplomacy in Southeast Asia." So Yue, you're going to have 30 to 35 minutes for your presentation. I will keep track of time, and then we will have comments and questions from Joseph and Aditya, and then a 15-minute Q&A session with attendees. By the way, just before I do, I must say this is highly, just so relevant. To me personally, health diplomacy is fascinating in the hands of any group or any country, and China's explorations of that realm are in keeping with explorations at the European level, US level, BRICS, all across the world. So this is going to be so insightful, and thank you on a personal level for that. Thank you. The screen is now yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you for everyone's coming and to meet all the members of Global South Network. And today I'm going to share of my research regarding to the Chinese vaccine diplomacy during the COVID-19 and how does the perception has hindered its impacts during the COVID-19 in Southeast Asia. And so personally, I'm Yue. I'm from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm doing a PhD and a PhD candidate. And I just recently finished this research, so I had quite a comprehensive context for these topics. So firstly, I will look into a brief background of my studies. So about the China's health sick role. And the Chinese health sick role was introduced by President Xi Jinping in 2015, but it was further highlighted in 2017 at the Big Belt and Road Forum as a strategic extension of the Belt and Road Initiative. It seeks to deepen health cooperation with partner countries and strengthen their capacity to respond to public health emergencies. The initiative serves multiple strategic goals by safeguarding health security in the Belt and Road nations and elevating China's role in global health governance. Through health projects, financial aid, technical assistance, and capacity building, China casts itself as a responsible global health contributor. This focus on international health cooperation helps counter negative perception of the Belt and Road's debt burdens and massive infrastructure footprints, while improving the worldwide view of the broader initiative. And by December of 2021, China has supplied ASEAN with 600 million vaccine doses and pledged another 150 million, along with the $5 million to the COVID-19 response fund. At the same time, the ASEAN Infrastructure the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank launched a $13 million crisis recovery facility to support pandemic management and strengthen regional health systems. Beijing's outreach echoed its 2003 SARS diplomacy, but focused squarely on the Belt and Road partners, deepening their reliance on the Chinese assistance by prioritizing its Belt and Road network for vaccine distribution. China has reinforced member states' commitment to infrastructure projects while advancing its broader strategic goals. And then move forward. So my research question will focus on how have pre-existing perception and territorial disputes in Southeast Asia affected the reception and impact of China's health diplomacy efforts. And what does this reveal about the limitation of vaccine diplomacy as a tool for improving geopolitical standing? In terms of the gap of the wider literature, I look into historical tensions and South China Sea disputes are likely to influence how Southeast Asian countries perceive Chinese vaccine aid, but their precise efforts remains under studies. Beijing's concurrent offering of health assistance alongside aggressive maritime actions may weaken trust, yet there is lack of understanding of how this soft versus hard power clashes shapes cooperation. And the political uptake of Chinese vaccine varies across the region, from Myanmar's military regime to the Philippines' official support despite public skepticism, to Vietnam's blend of ideological affirmative and historical caution, but no systematic comparison exists yet. It also remains unclear whether pandemic aid creates lasting strategic types or merely provides China with a temporary advantage until alternative suppliers emerged, highlighting a gap in our knowledge of a crisis diplomacy staying power. And as a result, we still don't know if vaccine diplomacy can overcome security concerns to reshape China's standing in Southeast Asia, or if territorial dispute will continue to block meaningful soft power advances. For my main argument is that China's vaccine diplomacy was hindered by its concurrent maritime aggression as the pursuit of territorial claims in the South China Sea made gaining goodwill impossible. This challenge was compounded by a deep-seated distrust in countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, where vaccine deliveries did little to repair China's image, and rather than being seen as a purely humanitarian aid, many Southeast Asian governments came to view Chinese doses as a geopolitical infrastructure, tools of influence rather than benevolent assistance. The shift toward commercial sales, which by late 2021 accounted for 3/4 of China's vaccine exports, only reinforced a profit-driven narrative over charitable intention. As a result, any tactical advantage China gained from early vaccine supplies quickly diminished once the Western alternatives became available. The theoretical framework I will focus on constructivism, since the social constructivism of health aid perception meant that pre-existing identity, historical narrative, and collective knowledge about China shaped Southeast Asian responses to vaccine diplomacy beyond purely material factors. By projecting a benevolent provider image through vaccines while asserting territorial claims in the South China Sea, Beijing sent contradictory identity signals that recipient countries could not resolve. These conflicting narratives manifested different across ASEAN. Vietnam and the Philippines interpreted identical vaccines initiatives as strategic opportunism, whereas other nations framed them as a pragmatic assistance. Despite the scale of China's material contributions, vaccine deliveries failed to transform deeply entrenched regional perception and identities. As a result, health cooperation remained constrained by socially constructed understandings of sovereignty and security, preventing it from emerging as an independent domain of the international relations. I will apply 3 case studies for this topic. In Myanmar, China's vaccine distribution unfolded the deep political upheaval as Beijing navigated relations with both the military junta, which is the military government, and the ethnic armed organizations. In the Philippines, the government's embrace of Chinese doses stood in sharp contrast to the widespread public skepticism rooted in ongoing territorial disputes. And lastly, in Vietnam, shared socialist ideology proved insufficient to overcome a legacy of the historical distrust. Together, these cases highlight the political, historical, and security factors that have constrained the effectiveness of the Chinese vaccine diplomacy. And the key sources for this analysis include the research from regional think tanks such as the Yusuf Ishak Institute from Singapore, the British Beijing Consulting, and with its China COVID-19 vaccine tracker. Also, it will include local media reports and editorials across the ASEAN countries, and also the official statements from government and the Chinese authorities. In terms of the significance and the contribution of this study, the study reframes soft power by positioning health diplomacy as a distinct instrument of the greater power competition, whose effectiveness depends on pre-existing strategic relationships and context rather than on the inherent value of the assistance provided. Despite China's substantial vaccine contribution during the COVID-19, its health diplomacy failed to reshape regional perception or secure territorial advantages. And this rapid shift from donation to commercial sales, which over 75% of the export by the late 2021, undermined Beijing's altruistic narrative and exposed the strategic limits of the crisis-driven diplomacy. In the meantime, China's effort to cast itself as a benevolent leader through health assistance directly conflicted with its assertive policy in contested waters. That conflict prevented meaningful trust building because security concerns consistently outweigh health cooperation efforts. So for the first case study, I will look into Philippines, and here's a short brief background before the pandemic. When the Duterte pandemic era support for China was built upon a relationship that had been developing for several years. China's backing of Duterte began with the arms sales when the US imposed restriction on weapons export to the Philippines back in 2016. And between the 2016 and 2020, China pledged to donate 14 million in small arms and fast boats, supporting Duterte's anti-drug efforts and counterterrorism initiative during a period when several international forums criticized his campaign for fostering impunity and systematic violence. Beijing also extended 500 million soft loan for other equipment. Following the October 2016 of Duterte's visit to China, the Philippines secured approximately 24 billion in trade and investment commitments. While Chinese support proved crucial for infrastructure projects that helping Duterte's domestic build infrastructure plans, even as the South China Sea disputes remain unsolved. From early 2020 onward, Duterte's publicity thanks President Xi Jinping for vaccine assistance, defended the safety of the Chinese doses, and refused the restriction of the Chinese visitors, declaring that the Chinese are bright. They will not venture into producing vaccines if it is not safe, secure, or sure. Despite his public phrase of cooperation, territorial disputes with China persisted. During Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Philippines back in 2021, China pledges 500,000 COVID-19 vaccine doses, 1.34 billion in infrastructure loans, and a 77 million grant. President Duterte maintained a non-confrontational stance with South China Sea disputes despite ongoing territorial tensions, arguing that the diplomatic engagement was preferable to military confrontation. As it put it, China has the weapons and we don't, leaving him no choice but to treat disputes as diplomatic endeavors. And China's vaccine diplomacy unfolded during the rising South China Sea tensions, highlighting by more than 200 Chinese vessels gathering near the White Sum Reef in March 2021. Meanwhile, China established the new administrative district in contested waters, assigned names to the key geographic features, conducted military exercise, and imposed fishing bans. A Chinese embassy's video titled Isang Dagat, which translated into English as the friendly neighbors, that provoked public outrage after including the maps that show disputed waters as part of China. When Foreign Minister Wang Yi delivered vaccine shipment, he also issued a quiet appeal to the control megaphone diplomacy in the maritime disputes to the Philippines. And I collected some data here, which by October of 2021, only 4.6% out of the 43.5 million Sinovac doses delivered to the Philippines have been donated, amounting to 2 million free doses, while the rest were purchased. In contrast, Cambodia received 9 million donated doses, and Myanmar received 6 million, reflecting China's stronger influence in those countries. By December of the year, the USA has provided 22 million vaccine doses, significantly more than 5 million China has contributed. And Chinese shipments reached their highest point at 11.1 million doses in August before declining, while deliveries of non-Chinese vaccines grew to 4 times the Chinese total by October. The concern about the price transparency arose when Chinese vaccines were offered at around $19 to $36 per dose, approximately around 3,600 Filipino pesos, while the Western alternative remained below $10. Despite Sinovac Biotech promoting what it is called the best friend forever rate. And although President Duterte's publicity supported these vaccines, public skepticism only grew during the pandemic, reinforcing broader concerns about China's intention. Furthermore, China's vaccine diplomacy delivered only modest soft power gains due to its commercial emphasis and unresolved territorial dispute in the region. As these developments unfolded, the Duterte's administration came under sharp criticism and faced the accusations of corruption over its purchase decisions, and ongoing doubts about the efficacy of Chinese vaccine further undermined the effort to achieve a widespread public acceptance. This is a second case study regarding Vietnam. And despite the shared communist ideology, Vietnam-China relations are defined by historical tensions, including the 1979 war and the maritime dispute in the South China Sea. Territorial disputes escalated during the pandemic, with China naming 80 features in the disputed waters, establishing new administrative districts, and an incident where a Vietnamese fishing boat was sunk. And during the pandemic, Vietnamese officials maintained their independence by investing in domestic vaccine development and initially resisting Chinese imports. Public opinion strongly favored Western vaccines, with only 4.2% of the Vietnamese experts trusting the Sinopharm or the Sinovac, comparing to 55.6% who preferred Pfizer or Moderna. Vietnam initially accepted the Sinopharm vaccines under the condition we reserve for Chinese nationals, broader residents, and travelers to China. The Chinese ambassador announced a 2 million doses donation just hours before the US Vice President Harris arrived with 1 million Pfizer doses. Each shipment was accompanied by diplomatic appeals to oppose the politicalization of the COVID-19 origin investigation. Despite this, Honai also maintained its policy of neutrality, stating that it would not ally with any countries to fight against another one, while carefully managing rising anti-China sentiment at home. And by April of 2022, the US has supplied Vietnam with nearly 40 million vaccine doses, far outpacing China's contribution of 7.3 million. Vietnam also secured roughly 30 million AstraZeneca, 5 million Moderna, 31 million Pfizer, and 20 million Sputnik V doses. Despite Beijing's vaccine diplomacy, Honai's foreign policy showed no appreciable towards China's interest in the South China Sea. This case illustrated how deep-rooted territorial disputes and public distrust can severely constrain a great power's ability to convert help aid into political influence. And lastly, I look into special cases in Myanmar. Since Myanmar's strategic importance to China arises from its role in the Belt and Road Initiative, where a 2.5 billion oil and gas pipeline from Karampur ports offers Beijing an alternative energy supply route. Despite this, long-standing anti-China sentiment, fueled by the tie to unpopular military regimes and environmentally damaging projects, has undermined the public opinions towards China. Early in the pandemic, Myanmar became the first Asian country to receive Chinese health aid when Foreign Minister Wang Yi pledged 300,000 vaccine doses in January 2021. Following the military coup in February 2021, China declined to condemn the military government and remain a key ally and arms supplier to the internationally isolated regime in Myanmar. The junta leveraged its control over the health distribution to selectively allocate health resources, using them as a political tool to consolidate its power. In the meanwhile, China pursued a dual-track strategy, which is publicity engaging with the military government while discreetly supplying vaccines to the ethnic armed organization in broader regions to safeguard its zero-COVID policy through the official channel by the Red Cross Society of China near the China-Myanmar border. This aimed to stabilize the border while protecting the Belt and Road oil pipeline through the junta and the ethnic armed organizations' conflict zones. And the Chinese military's delivery of 500,000 Sinopharm doses to Yangon airport was highlighted by the local news agencies in Myanmar that Beijing's intent to strengthen ties with the military armed leaders. Together, this parallels effort fueled public fears of Chinese influence in Myanmar's domestic affairs. Initial vaccine donations shifted dramatically to commercial sales, with 77% of the doses sold commercially by December 2021 rather than donated. By 2022, Myanmar had purchased 33.7 million of the 56.34 million total doses, which is around 60%, and receiving only 22.64 million as donations. And this pushed forward commercialization, included opening Southeast Asia's first Sinopharm factory in Myanmar back in March 2022. Together, this move shows China's pragmatic strategy, establishing goodwill through initial aid, then convert the relationship into commercial revenue through sales. Move forward to my conclusion. Despite contributing 25% of the global vaccine donation and 28.6% of the sales, China's efforts were limited on transforming its regional image, undermined by its fundamental contradiction between promoting a benevolent health leadership and also pursuing assertive territorial policies. While early tactical advantage from being the first provider proved fleeting, and the shift towards commercial sales, which rising to 77% by the late 2021, undermine any generosity narratives. Moreover, Southeast Asian countries overwhelmingly opted for Western vaccines when they became available. Vaccine acceptance did not translate into a territorial concession, and China's maritime assertiveness directly counteracted by any diplomatic gains from its vaccine diplomacy. So the limitation, the research could not incorporate field observations or direct interviews because it was in the middle of the pandemic. And so it relies on the methodological triangulation using a range of documentary sources to compensate. And also there's a language barrier that further restricted the access to the non-English materials, meaning that the dependence on English language document may have overlooked some local perspective, and the local viewpoints are likely to be ignored, which cannot be included in this research and made it into a limitation. And I think this is all of my research so far. And thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to hearing your comments and suggestions regarding this topic. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Yue. Thank you. I think, you know, if we were all in the same room together, we would be applauding you for the depth and breadth of your research. So I hope you can feel that energy coming from everyone who has listened, certainly from myself, and hopefully I'll have the chance to talk a little bit more later on. But for now, the next step, and thank you, by the way, for being so timely. We are right on schedule. I invite comments and questions from Aditya and Joseph. You guys can decide who goes first.
So first I want to thank you for the very generous introduction, and to Nauman for inviting me to participate in this wonderful forum, and to Yue Yang for the opportunity to get to know this important work that you're doing, which I think illuminates really concretely where an emerging great powers priorities are through their concrete actions that in this case include things like vaccine donations and sales, and the way in which they are sometimes in tension with other actions in the sphere of international relations. So here at Boston University, we recently hosted the CREG meetings. That's SEAREG, and you can learn more about them at creg.org. And this is a constellation of political science scholars who do work on Southeast Asia, and I want to really encourage you to apply to be a CBREG fellow in the future. The kind of comparative research that you're doing on Southeast Asia is sorely needed, and I'd love to see the deep comparative work on Myanmar, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And of course, we know this is really hard. Not a lot of people embark on this because of challenges with different languages, the cultural literacy required. And obviously, I know there are limitations that you covered in your work, but it was great to see work, particularly on these issues as they relate to global health, because global health has simply not been a great interest to political science and sociology. So kudos to you. I think that this presentation and work is really full of great meaty facts that really need to be highlighted and brought to the attention of the public and scholars more generally. Things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank playing a role in establishing this $13 billion crisis recovery facility for pandemic management and health system strengthening. That was something in passing that you mentioned, but I think has not gotten a lot of attention. Also, how much Myanmar spent on vaccine doses versus what was donated to it. We often think about donations in relation to Myanmar, particularly in relation to health, but here you highlight, I think, spending, and that's quite interesting, and not much has been written about that. So some really important empirical contributions. Those are just some examples, but kudos to you for that. I want to talk about a few different larger points you make. So you argue that China's vaccine diplomacy was hampered by its simultaneous maritime aggression, and that essentially this was compounded by deep-seated distrust in countries like Philippines and Vietnam, where vaccine deliveries did little to repair China's image. And later, Southeast Asian countries shifted rapidly towards Western vaccines. And this revealed preferences shaped by historical grievances and distrust. And I wouldn't contest that assertion. I think that's right. The issues you point to exist and are real. But I want to say two things. One, I do think you could offer a bit greater acknowledgement of the real differences that there were between different kinds of vaccines during the pandemic. And that would be really helpful for understanding why we see this shift, right, from Chinese vaccines at the beginning to mRNA vaccines, right, which had the greatest efficacy, were based on new technology, and were widely perceived by the scientific community and the public as the creme de la creme of vaccines for COVID. It's true that Chinese vaccines were among the most widely used in the world, particularly in the global south. And it's also really important to underscore that China gave them when it really mattered at the beginning, right? When access was hard, right? And so even if they were less efficacious, they were doing quite a lot, and the West much less so in the beginning. And so the shift is interesting, but I think that that's a dynamic you could acknowledge more. Second, you cast this tension between this benevolent project of China in contradiction with its aggressive approach to the South China Sea. And I like the tensions you draw up within the different cases. But to me, rather than the South China Sea actions hampering its vaccine diplomacy, I see these two different initiatives as highly complementary. And even though they are in tension, illustrate really how vaccine diplomacy is a tool, right, to help manage tensions in international relations. Clearly, China wants to take in some areas, right? But vaccine diplomacy is an area where it can give, right? And so I don't see this quite the same way that you do, but I do think it's an interesting piece. Secondly, you point to tensions, obviously, in the China relationship, but I think you miss an opportunity to acknowledge tensions that also exist in relationship to these countries in the West, right? Including pressures that an economic hegemon in the US sometimes exerts, and also fraught colonial legacies, right, with France, Britain, and the US. And I'd love to hear you say more about that. You also note that China made limited strategic gains. Well, this led me to ask, well, what were its goals originally? Right, I'd love to hear more about that. Did China really expect to transform its image, or that vaccine diplomacy would fully offset South China Sea aggression? For me, that's hard to imagine. And I think that a more serious treatment of the original goals it had would help give insight into what they were really hoping for, right? And as if and also the question of if it was truly as ineffective as you imply, or if this did just simply offset somewhat, right? Things that it was going to do anyway. You mentioned that nations viewed vaccines like infrastructure investments, potentially influencing tools rather than humanitarian aid. And this made me wonder which nations, donor nations, recipient nations, both. But I want to emphasize that these are just questions that raised to ponder as you go forward writing really wonderful books and articles about this. I really love this project. And as someone who's working on comparative project on health diplomacy, I really think we need more of this work. And I thought of people's work like Petra Alderman's great book, Branding Authoritarian Nations. I thought of Rohan Mukherjee's book, Ascending Order, and a new special issue of Politics and Governments on Novel Perspectives on Status as kind of works that you could tie into if you want to engage and sort of create a larger audience. So just some things to think about. I really love this project, and I'm really pleased to have gotten a chance to be here and learn from you.
Joseph, thank you so much. Incredibly insightful. Thank you for bringing your wealth of experience and detailed knowledge of this realm to this discussion. We will hopefully have time to hear more from you a little later. Aditya, could I ask you for your comments now as well, please? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. And as someone who's doing research on health diplomacy as well, it's great to have heard your perspective. I have a couple of thoughts. The first is that there's this riding question in global health diplomacy as to what conditions are necessary for global health diplomacy to take place, and in the context that you're offering, would an overwhelming burden of COVID at that time take precedence over deep distrust of China's maritime aggression or the historical relationship that it has had with countries in the region? Do you think that there is scope to sort of examine that? And secondly, just to go for what Dr. Harris said about the efficacy of the vaccine, that in such a situation where there's an overwhelming burden of COVID, would countries be more open to accepting vaccines given the circumstances, as opposed to this conversation around the technology around mRNA vaccines and things like that? So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are. And also, if you could tell us how you arrived at constructivism being the sort of right theoretical framework for your study, and some of the work that you've done on that front as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the question regarding of efficacy and the countries, and because when China first offering the vaccines, and most of the Western pharmaceutical companies, they were accused of vaccine nationalism because they were not willing to share about the patterns of the vaccines. And this is not only happened in Southeast Asia, of course. Another part of my research focusing on Africa. And Africa has more severe problems because most of the countries, they are the global south countries, they have very limited funding for purchasing vaccines. And even with the limited vaccine access due to the price, it's also due to the availability. So another part of my research, I also look into Africa. When I found they have the similar issues, they are selling the vaccine to Africa with a similar price, which is much higher than those offered by the Western pharmaceutical companies. So that time, it makes Chinese vaccine the only one available because they don't really have a choice. And so, but although effective remain questions, and there is also another news that President Duterte, when he phrased the Chinese vaccine, he also injected the Chinese vaccine before it was approved in Philippines, and he also injected to other guards near the presidents. and that makes kind of like a criticism from the local Congress saying like they shouldn't do that because they don't have any confirmation from either the World Health Organization or from the local hospital proving the vaccine is safe. But they were the only one available there. And regarding your first question, I didn't get it. Could you repeat your first questions, please?
Yeah, I was talking about the conditions that that are necessary for health diplomacy to take place,
Yeah.
and whether an urgent need for COVID vaccines because of the high burden of COVID would take precedence over historical distrust.
Okay, thank you. So the condition for the health diplomacy to take place. Yes, I agree with you. It is an urgent situation. And also, like we mentioned in the presentation, like Vietnam, they were offered by the Chinese government saying like we are offering the vaccine at the first place before we're offering the others. But the Vietnamese rejected, although it is an urgent condition, but I think the sovereignty, the problem of the sovereignty, and also the problem of the territorial dispute, I think is the priority over the health diplomacy. So although the global crisis can be a condition for conducting the health diplomacy, but I think the countries, they are still taking quite a realistic approach towards the health diplomacy, which means like if they are offering the vaccine, they will consider if China is asking for diplomatic concessions, which also similar to the previous Belt and Road projects, because once the China offering the funding and other technological assistance, other countries they are not very sure if China will ask anything in return. So, and also in the meanwhile, most of these vaccine deliveries they were not open to the public. So means there is a problem of transparency. So I think they will prioritize the sovereignty first before taking the Chinese vaccines. So I think that's kind of like, even it's under urgent situations, and that's a similar situation that limited China's Belt and Road projects in other countries, especially in the global south. And you have another question on the constructivism. Yeah, so I use constructivism because most of the time, like if we mention like vaccine diplomacy, China offering vaccine delivered to other countries, it's usually measured by the material factors. But most of the thing is, if the local people, they will accept Chinese vaccines and they will seeing the Chinese vaccine as a good thing, as something that China is generously offering the vaccine without no returns or conditions. This is usually not able to measure by the materials factor, because even China offering a lot of vaccine to Myanmar, for example, say around 22 million to Myanmar, even it is donation. But in the same time, the local people, they don't believe these 22 million vaccines were meant to contributing to the country's health. Rather, they see as something to support the local government as an oppression. Because during the COP, there were many like medical staffs. They walk on the street protesting the military government overturn the democratic government. And so when they receiving the Chinese vaccine offered by the government, they will believe that the Chinese government is using the vaccine as something to legitimize the COP's legitimacy. So it's to legitimize the illegal military government's COP rather than really helping the local people for the access of the vaccine and for their health. So that's why I choose constructivism, because it is not something we can measure by the amount of vaccine donated or delivery, but constructivism could explain the impact after the vaccine delivered and how the public opinion is treating Chinese vaccine in the global south countries.
Yue, would you like to respond to any of Dr. Harris' comments or questions?
And thank you very much for the comments. And I think these are very helpful, especially from Professor Harris' comments regarding like other countries' pre-existing relations with those global south countries. That's something I am missing from, because when I look into this research, I just look like, because it was started because many people think like when China talks about vaccine diplomacy, it means like China donated all the vaccines rather than selling most of the vaccines. And this was also inspired by my previous project, my postgraduate dissertation, when people say like China has invested a lot of funding to Africa and it's always increasing. But then I found back in 2017, the funding has declining. So it is again like what people believe, like China has always giving money to Africa. And in the same time, when looking back to Southeast Asia, so most opinion might think China has gained a lot of tactical advantages all the time and throughout the whole pandemic, and donated a lot of vaccine just to compete with the United States and other Western countries. But when I looked into the data, and I found most of the vaccine were sold there, and also it did not create a lot of advantage, especially after 2022 when there are Western vaccine alternatives. So I think that's why I started this research. And of course, those pre-existing relations with other countries is still quite important because they are still remain relevant until today's international relations. Yeah, I think that's quite okay. And I look forward to hearing other comments and questions as well. Thanks a lot.
If I could just say one thing in response, yeah, I too thought that point was really interesting, this commercialization aspect that you raised, and I love that you brought it up. You know, this and sort of conceptualize this project as thinking not just about donations, because you clearly show it wasn't just about that. And I actually have a chapter coming out in a book that's going to be published by University of Michigan Press on vaccine diplomacy that looks at Thailand's vaccine production and distribution efforts. And boy, there was a lot of vaccines that came from China, right? China's a big part of the story, and much of it was donated, but I think there were also business relationships that were formed. And so to me, what you show is, I think, very much in line with the kinds of things I see in other countries as well. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone again for being so engaged and also so timely. We have 8 minutes left, which gives us some little bit of time finally for the rest of the audience and rest of the participants to make any comments or questions. I would ask you to maybe try to keep them brief if we can, but let's just see how it goes. Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, Yue, thank you so much for that presentation. It's very interesting. I just have one question on the funding aspect that you just mentioned, because I came across a paper from 2021. The title, I'll put the full title in the chat so everybody can have it, but it's by Yue Yang Chen, and it's on how China is reshaping international credit governance. It was published in the European Journal of International Relations in 2021. But the data actually, I know you said the data is China didn't gain massive competitive advantages, but the data says completely the opposite. China's funding is significantly higher, like magnitudes higher, like more than triple the amount that the US is funding. So there is quite a significant, in terms of constructivist sense, there's definitely a significant sovereignty element there. China absolutely does have competitive advantages in the global system, and it is leveraging them quite aggressively through its 2 foreign development banks. Again, I'll put the full paper in the chat so everybody can see, but I'd just be interested in where did you get your data from and what do you think about that?
And thank you very much. So I got most of the data from, so there are two agencies I use. So one is the UNIVERSITYOFLEEDS Institute, which is a consulting, I think it's a think tank from Singapore, and they have quite a lot of data collecting from the local academic people to the countries. And also I have another one, which is by British Consulting Beijing. They have like a data collection, but it is only last until 2022. And that's also a very big problem of this project because, and I think I forgot to put into the limitation because most of the data, they are not transparent. So because the Chinese government, I tried to conduct an interview until I was told there's no way you can get into the real data, especially when it comes to the amount of the vaccines donated, delivers, even how much they were sold. So it is a big problem. So I think most of the academic think tanks, they have some difference in collecting the data. And that's why it's also make a lot of difference in different papers and different journals, saying like maybe they have a different data collection strategies, but from the one I collected, I think just because that's a big limit, because we don't really have the access to the Chinese government's data, even the academic think tanks, and yeah, so I think that's how they cause such difference across different papers. Thank you.
That is fair enough, Yue. Lies, damn lies, and statistics, as the saying goes, and of course the issue of data access. Thank you. Any other questions from anyone else? Now is the time. Please feel free to comment or put up your hand or just speak. I think at this stage, anyone else from the group, from the audience? In a way, that's good, because I don't think we have the time, unfortunately, to get into a more detailed discussion of further topics. But because we do have just a couple of minutes left before we finish, Yue, I just want to add something myself, from from listening to your presentation and my compliments on that. Health diplomacy it's so hard to measure. It's a force in the world. I would say, based on my 4 years in the Indo-Pacific, it's something that China has a right to deploy, whether it's in a Machiavellian way or an altruistic way, or maybe both. Certainly, many other countries, as I said at the beginning, are attempting to use health diplomacy in that soft power context. And with varying degrees of success, as soft power, becomes less of a priority for some countries. It presents potential opportunities for others to see if they can leverage that. In their favor, and almost you could say, to put it to the test. Is it something that actually works? Can it be quantified? And that's what perhaps we're going to find out over the next period of time, months, years, decades. We will actually see empirically whether or not this works. I think it works. I don't think it's out of step with other strategies. Russia deployed health diplomacy at the same time as initiating war in Ukraine. The list goes on, and it's one of many tools. And I think your approach of taking positive rather than normative views on these things is really helpful. If that isn't too much academic terminology, describing things as they are rather than as they should be is something I think always brings value to these discussions. Yeah, thank you so much, Yue. Thank you for everyone for a lovely presentation. Yeah, please add comments, just like Rona did there. Thank you, Rona. And thank you from me and from everyone, Yue, for a really insightful presentation of your doctoral project. which stands to be a great contribution to the wider literature on health diplomacy. Thanks so much, Dr. Harris and Aditya, for your comments, and indeed to everyone who attended the session. So thoughtful and great reflections. The Global South Network, just so you all know, warmly welcomes PhD students from any discipline in any part of the world to share their projects and receive interdisciplinary feedback. Anyone interested in presenting their work or participating in a session can contact Dr. Naumann, the founder and the convener of the Global South Network, at the email address provided in the chat box. Same time next week, we will be meeting our next guest speaker, Bashman Mohammed, PhD candidate, School of Law, University of Aberdeen, who will present their PhD project entitled Workers' Participation in Corporate Governance. That's 14th of May from 3 until 4, same time, same place. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation, and thank you for the opportunity to chair this session. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, Rayad.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.